So what is so interesting about these old pre-war cars anyway? Welcome to Petrol Lounge. Presenting the Hispano-Suiza H6B. It is 1925 and they are still figuring out what a car is. Everything that you think of as standard today isn't really standard in this car. So it's just everywhere you look, there's something unusual, different, works unexpectedly, and the whole car is an enormous work of art. Hispano-Suiza was a ultra premium brand in the 1920s and the 1930s. If your neighbors brought home a Rolls-Royce and you wanted to be a little bit better and show them up, this is the car that you bought. It was way more technologically advanced than anything else that was being built at the time. And the original founder of the company, or co-founder, Mark Bierkent, his name is a little weird and difficult to pronounce. It's Mark Bierkent. He was originally making planes, plane engines, and artillery pieces for the French in World War I. And after the war, he decided, you know what? I've got all this machinery and equipment. I'm going to start making cars. So he shaved down the V12 that he had in his planes, made it an inline six, dropped it into a car, and started building these things in France and in Spain. This car in particular was built in France. And funny enough, the name Hispano-Suiza means Spanish Swiss. And it's not really a Swiss company. This is a Spanish company headquartered in Spain. And they had factories in France and in Spain. No cars were ever produced in Switzerland, and this car itself was produced in France. Your rolling chassis had the suspension, the wheels, the tires, the engine, transmission, basically everything needed to drive the car. It included the dashboard and the steering wheel, but you didn't have anything else. It didn't come with the fenders, didn't come with the body. It was just bare. And when you got the car, then you took it to your coach builder, and everyone had their favorite coach builder that they took it to. The coach builder for this one happens to be a very storied French coach builder, and forgive me, there's going to be a lot of French names today, and I'm going to struggle to get them all right with the pronunciations right, but it's Belvalet is the French manufacturer here, or not manufacturer, but coach builder. They built the coach. They were considered one of the premier coach builders of the time. They didn't build a whole lot because they spent a lot of time on every single one that they built. They built approximately 4 Hispano-Suizas with this coachwork, or with their particular coachwork. Each one was slightly unique based on the whims of the owner. And that kind of gets into, like, if you see another 1930 or 1925 or whatever Hispano-Suiza and you hear, oh, this is also an H6B, you may look at it and go, well, it looks completely different from this. It doesn't look the same. And that's because every single one of these would have been a completely custom piece. This particular car has an interesting history behind it. It was built in 1925, delivered to its owner in France, and that owner's family seems to have kept the car for the next 40 years. The interesting thing is we're not really sure what happened to the car during that time. So the maintenance history on this car goes all the way to 1939, and 1939 in France, as you can imagine, you know, it's a little bit of a troubled time. So everything about the car seems to just disappear from that point until the 1980s. And we get 2 conflicting reports here. One is really interesting of the car was found in a cave in 1984, 1985. And nobody knows, you know, how it ended up in that cave or what it was doing there or why. And the history just kind of picks up where it left off. Maybe it was hidden from the Nazis. Maybe the owner never got to come back for it. What we do know is it appears that the same family did own it. The family name that bought it originally in 1925 is the same family name that had it in the 1980s. What can't be verified is, was it actually in a cave, or did they just put this in a barn and forgot about it, or who knows? Kind of just this mysterious forgotten car for a long time. But it was in really good condition. It was restored, and then it was owned for a time by one of the premier Hispano-Suiza experts in the country. And he not only restored it to Concours condition, he also restored it mechanically. And I can tell you, just from doing this business as long as I have, you see a lot of Concours cars that look beautiful, and they're an absolute mess when you go to drive them. It's really, the cars aren't driven that much and they don't need to be driven, so the owners really focus on, let's make sure that they look beautiful, and less, hey, can we drive this car? Can we do something with this car? I see a lot of things in this engine that I'm like, this really was probably 30 or 40 years ahead of its time. And this is a all aluminum engine. There's a ton of aluminum used in this car, in the engine. Really unusual for the time. Aluminum was still fairly expensive. Literally just 30, 40 years before, aluminum was considered a precious metal along the lines of platinum or gold. There's even bars of aluminum in the Royal Jewels collection, because back then they were like, hey, here, have this big bar of aluminum, and people freaked out because it was super hard to get, it was super rare. And then we figured out how to extract it, and all of a sudden it was everywhere. But aluminum engine, this is a inline six. Originally it was 6.6 liters, and the compression ratio was 4.1. When this was rebuilt, I want to say about 10, 15 years ago, they went through and they went ahead and bored out the engine and increased the compression ratio. So now it is a 7-liter inline six, and the compression ratios are 7.1. There's not a whole lot to do over here. It has the exhaust side of the engine. The big maintenance thing that's over here is the oil gauge. You turn this little thing here, and then you push this thing down, and it rises up and it tells you what your oil level is. And the weirdness doesn't stop there. When we come underneath the engine, you'll see these bolts under here. These are actually the crankshaft bolts. And today we drop the oil pan, and then you can get to the crankshaft and you'll take off the main bolts and drop the crankshaft from there. On this car, if you drop the oil pan, the crankshaft is coming with it. And interestingly enough, the crankshaft in this is a billet piece. It was milled from a 600-pound block of steel, and I want to say it weighs 35 pounds now. But yes, inside this block is a billet crankshaft just to handle the full 135 horsepower that this engine makes. You see this big hole here. We do have the cranking mechanism. I'm sure you've seen videos of this, where old-timey cars, people are cranking on them by hand. You could do that with this car. It was expected that maybe the electric starter that this car is fitted with would give out, and this was kind of a fallback plan, but it was not considered to be the normal course of operation. There is actually an electric starter on this. The first thing we have to do is we have to flood the carburetor. So we push this button until literally fuel flows out of the carburetor. Okay, we have flooded the carburetor. And now we come inside the car. And I swear people were smaller back then. I am not a big guy. And getting in this car is always a little bit tricky. There's a lot of levers in your way. The steering wheel really comes down here on the seat, and you just kind of have to be a little bit careful. And I think I remember everything on how to set this, but I'm actually going to get our cheat sheet so I can be sure. And so we have to turn on the electricity, and then, now I have not been told what these switches do on the dash. I'm just told this is the configuration to put the switches in. These levers here control the air-fuel mixtures on the engine themselves, and they need to be in this position. And then this is going to be your advance ignition. So we have to advance the ignition timing just a little bit. Well, actually quite a bit to get the car to start. This is our throttle control, so we're going to move that up just a little bit. Make sure that we're not in gear here. And then there is a push button on the dash, and we're going to see if we can get this to start. to stop the engine to be able to talk over it. It is a little bit loud when the engine is running, but it's a really smooth engine. I mean, all inline sixes are exceptionally smooth anyway, and this one's no exception. And it's just a real work of art, this particular engine. Like I said, super advanced for its time. All aluminum block, had steel sleeves for the cylinders. Just amazing, still runs amazing today, makes a great noise. It's kind of crazy. If you think about the displacement, it's 7 liters, you have 6 cylinders, it's over a liter per cylinder. So it's got a really deep note that I'm not sure is going to come out on the film here, but when you hear it in person, I don't want to even say it sounds like a truck. It's so deep. It sounds like nothing else that you've ever been around. It's kind of like a truck, kind of like a tractor, kind of like a car, and very, very unique to this particular automobile. Also, something else that I did while this engine was running, there is an exhaust cutout on this automobile because back in the day, in the city, you were going to need to have the muffler. You were going to need to keep the car quiet, not scare everybody else's horses or disturb all the people. But once you made out to the countryside, to your house, you really wanted to open that exhaust up because we're talking, it's 1925, the exhaust isn't that sophisticated. It's quiet, or quiet-ish, but it's really, really restrictive. And so you would open it up, and that would gain you probably another 20 horsepower or so that might actually make the difference when you're driving up a hill or, down into a valley on your farm. And that's why it's there. And when you really open it up and you really hear the uncorked engine, it's almost impossibly deep. This has a 3-position top. This is all the way closed. You could open it all the way to here, which was considered the town car configuration, which lets your driver be out in the elements. But you in the back, you would be enclosed and protected, and you wouldn't have to deal with all that. Or if it was a really nice day, you could fold the top all the way down. But even weirder are these windows. So in most cars, most coach builders would have had kind of like what the Dodge Viper, the first generation Dodge Viper had, where you had these windows that kind of slotted in, and then you would put the top up. This is way different. So when you open the doors, these windows are attached, and there's a button here that you push, and then this window will fold back. This would have been your town car configuration. You still have the closed windows back here for the passengers. The front is open, but then it's a really nice day. I'm going to put the top all the way down. This is truly unique here. So this door opens up, and you notice this door is really, really thick, way thicker than on most cars of this period. And you turn this knob, and this opens up. And then this whole encasement just folds right down into the door. And then you close this up around it, and the windows disappear. And we're just going to keep moving inside the car from here. There's a lot of unique stuff in here. One of our favorite things is this lever here. When you get inside the car, you find that there's 3 levers, and 2 of them are really easy to figure out. The first one here is your handbrake, and it kind of looks like an old school trolley car handbrake. You push it in like this to set it. This is your gear shifter, and I will say this is one of the best feeling gear shifters that I have ever found. It shifts like butter. It is so smooth. It is obviously just this, it's almost like you're manipulating a Swiss watch. It is crazy how nice it is just to shift this car. Now, it does not have synchros in the transmission. Those were not a thing yet. So you do have to, match your shifts and double clutch. It's a little tricky, but it does feel wonderful. Now, what is this one? This actually controls the headlights. And if you look up front, you will find that the headlights are in the high beam position. And when you push this forward, it pulls a rod down through here, and it actually dips the headlights into the low beam position. Again, this is something that I have never seen in any other car, even of other cars of this time period. Originally, cars were what we called horseless carriages. They were basically a horse-drawn carriage that somebody had taken the horses off of, thrown an engine on, and started driving around. And back in those days, you did have what was called a dashboard, which came up in front of you. And the reason behind that was, as the horses would run, they would start to dash, and you're off-road again, and they're kicking up mud and muck, and you don't want that flying up on you and getting on your clothes. So you had this curved piece of wood that was in front of you to protect from all of the mud and the muck that the horses were kicking up, and that was called your dashboard. Well, when they started building horseless carriages, you needed a place to put all the gauges that you were going to need to see how the engine was operating. And where was the obvious place to put those? Well, right there on the dashboard. The fuel gauge works remarkably different than we are used to. And if you're looking at this right now, you're saying, well, we've got, I mean, zero fuel, or actually maybe even below that. How do I check my fuel? You have this knob here, and you actually pull it out, and you let it go, and it pressurizes the system and tells you we have approximately 22 liters of fuel. And that is truly one of the stranger things about this car. It's not completely accurate. You get an idea of about what you have, and sometimes you'll get a little different as you measure it 2 or 3 or 4 times. If you were the owner of this car, if you bought this car new, you were going to ride in it. And what is it like to ride in this car? Well, I mean, it's really nice and plush back here. I mentioned that I thought people were smaller back in the day. There is plenty of room back here, even for somebody that's bigger than me, but I wouldn't say you want to be much bigger than me. There's not a ton more headroom. So if you're really tall in the torso, you may find yourself brushing up against the top of the car. The seats are really comfortable, especially for the era that we're talking about. Some interesting little tidbits. These were your, kind of map pockets of the time. I find they have a real old-timey stagecoach kind of feel, but these are in all the doors, these little pockets here. This piece was a kind of like a blanket that you could bring up and attach around your legs, so that if it was really cold outside, you didn't have all of the cold air coming inside the car and making you cold. It's kind of one of those things that we don't really mess with very often, and it's kind of complicated. So I'm not going to pull it up and button it down, but that is what that was for. Just again, owing to that luxury feel of this car. If you did want to take the car out, top down, you didn't have a heater back in those days. The engine and transmission would certainly transmit some heat up through the floorboard, but there's no air vents back here. There's no way to say, oh, hey driver, I'm feeling a little cold. You'd better bundle up and be prepared for that. But again, in 1925, you're coming from, horse-drawn carriages and things like that. This was not unexpected or something that people were unprepared for. They really did just understand, even in a luxury item, hey, if you're riding around in the countryside and it's wintertime, you're probably going to be cold. Just, make sure you bring your blankets and, I don't know, maybe some hardtack or something. But but it just really feels remarkable sitting back here. I'm very comfortable. I have tons of leg room. I can really spread out. And I'm sure this was just the most amazing, luxurious ride you could have in 1925. Moving around through the back of the car, you can see these, I believe these are called landaulet bars. And we see these on cars sometimes today, particularly hearses, you'll see these. And they've kind of lost their meaning. They're just kind of a decorative piece on a lot of cars today, but they were very functional originally. This is part of the folding top. Your top was both inside and outside, the mechanisms and everything. So this is a structural piece of the top. It does provide a function. The wheels themselves are also uniquely different. These are a split rim wheel, which if you're familiar with heavy machinery, you may be familiar with these. They are a little bit treacherous and dangerous compared to modern wheels. They're also extremely high pressure. Ordinarily, a car like this, you would expect the tire pressures to be somewhere around 35 psi. These are sitting at 65 psi. They do have a tube inside them. And another thing that's unusual is you'll see these little pieces of metal wrapped around the spokes in a few places. And this was your balancing weights on the car back then. And that's the only way you can really balance it today as well, particularly if you're wanting to do a period correct thing and take this to a concourse show. This is something that the concourse judges will be looking for, that you actually did do the wheel balancing the way that it was done back then. And coming around to the rear, you will see this big, huge trunk back here. And again, one of those funny things that we never think about today, much like the dashboard. I talk about the trunk in my car. I never really think about the term or what it means or where it came from or anything else. But literally, at one time, it was a literal trunk. And this is detachable from the car. You have a little tool. You can take this off. You can bring it inside your house or your hotel room or wherever you happen to be staying. And you would pack this in the house, and then you would bring it out and attach it to your car. And then when you arrived wherever you were going, detach it from the car, bring it in, unpack all your things. And that terminology has continued on today. The trunk as a trunk really had disappeared by the 1930s, but we still have the term with us 100 years later. You needed to carry all of the implements to take care of the car, to start the car, to manage any kind of roadside emergency that you might have. And that's what this is. If you open this up, it's just a small box that contains all the little accoutrements that you need to keep this car running on a long distance car trip. And you still need them today because, you know, even though things have gotten better today, this car is still pretty much the way it was in 1925. You still have to stop and lube the suspension every so often. You still have to stop and, you know, expect to set the points on the distributors. You still have to manage this car every probably 150 to 200 miles. You are kind of doing something with this car, and that's why you have this box, is to keep all those things kind of together and keep them out of the nice, you know, interior portions of the car, or out of your trunk where all your clothes are. That's where all the dirty stuff lives. Even the steering in this car doesn't work the way you would expect it to. It's a really unusual mechanism. So when you turn the wheel, it does come down into this gearbox here, just like a normal steering box, and it translates that rotational movement into this gearbox here, which then goes under the car and pushes a very, very long lever underneath the fender here down into the wheel, and it's actually more of like a push rod turning. And yeah, it's so unusual. It's so strange, so different. I've never seen another car like this. I don't even really know how to explain it to you, but you can see it in operation. There was a French fighter ace, Georges Guimer, really famous World War II ace. He flew Hispano-Suiza airplanes. And so when Hispano-Suiza decided they were going to start making automobiles, they wanted to honor him, honor his squadron, and this stork was painted on the side of the airplanes of that particular squadron in this configuration, this style, and they went and molded this into their own hood ornament. So it's a callback to the airplane origins of this particular brand, and it's just a really remarkable piece. Everybody that comes in, it's one of the first things they really notice. They look at it, they ask questions about it. It's one of the more dramatic ones that I have seen on any car, and it's just obvious a lot of time and effort went into building this. And you know, I even look at it today and wonder, you know, gosh, you know, if you had to recreate that today, just the amount of manpower and time. I don't even know that a modern manufacturer would even think of doing something like this today. I hope by kind of walking through all this, I can kind of show you why those of us that are around all these kind of cars all the time get so enthusiastic about pre-war cars and the unusual nature of them and what makes them so special. We're always, you know, in and around unusual stuff, getting to experience new things, and we really want to share that with you. We've got more content coming your way, so definitely hit the like and subscribe button and keep your eyes open, because we're going to be back with more new material that's going to wow you just like this did.